This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 320 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. So on Tuesday on the 10 Trend Show, I brought up the fact that Patrick Mahomes has regressed from a touchdown perspective this year, but he hasn't been any worse as a player. Touchdowns bring a lot of variance, so this isn't that surprising. It was going to be hard for Mahomes and the Chiefs offense to maintain the scoring rate that they had last season. Now, I got a little pushback from people, and it all surrounded Tyreek Hill. The clear difference between this year and last year, aside from Mahomes' injury, has been Tyreek Hill not being able to find the field. And it's a super fair criticism. So I want to say a few things on that subject before we get to the mailbag questions. First, injury luck is still embedded into regression. If a team gets really lucky with injuries one year, that's not bound to happen the following season. Second, it's important to remember that the Chiefs also added pieces to the offense. It's not like we have a one-to-one relationship here with one of those sides just not having Tyreek Hill. They drafted Mecole Hardman, for example, and Sammy Watkins is healthier this year. And third, and I think this is the most important thing that I'm going to talk about today, but third, how many more touchdowns do you think Patrick Mahomes would have thrown for this season if Tyreek Hill were healthy? It's not like his touchdown rate right now is 8% after it being 8.6% last year. It's 5.9%. In order for Mahomes to get to that 8.6% rate, based on his 323 pass attempts, he would have had to have thrown 8 to 9 more touchdowns right now than he's currently thrown for. 8 more touchdowns would give him an 8.4% touchdown rate. That's still lower than last year. And I think that we can all agree that 8 or 9 more touchdowns at this point in the season is an absurd number to expect from one player being absent. Like, sure, maybe the Chiefs are more efficient offensively with Tyreek Hill on the field. And maybe they don't throw as many passes. And maybe some of the rushing touchdowns that they've had this year, those turn into passing touchdowns. But 8 to 9 touchdowns? That's a lot of freaking touchdowns. It's okay to say that last year for Patrick Mahomes was the high end of his range of outcomes from a touchdown standpoint. Maybe he hits that range again. But it shouldn't be the expectation. That's the key here. I'm not saying he's not good. I'm not saying he'll never touch 2018's numbers ever again. I'm saying we can't expect that to happen year in and year out. And by blaming it all on the Tyreek Hill injury or even the Mahomes injury itself, that's making excuses for obvious regression. Now, before getting into this week's questions, I've got a free roll link for you guys. Head to fanduel.com/league/Brandon, enter your daily fantasy lineup for free, and have a shot to win free Number Fire Premium and even a little bit of cash. That's fanduel.com/league/Brandon to enter. This first question is from @BoltsChief. What the hell do we do with David Johnson? Sorry to the kids. 0 trade value, 0 touches last week. Is he a hold and see what happens player? I think you answered the question within the question here. He's a hold. Your hope is that his poor performance has been partially injury related, and that out of the bye, he'll be healthier. Kenyon Drake's been good, but 0 touches for David Johnson tells me at least something is going on. So you've got to just hold tight and hope that things can turn around. This next question is from @Joe41076399. Is Todd Gurley back? So I've talked about on my 10 Trend Show all season long how the Rams aren't utilizing their running backs much in the passing game. And even though they saw an increase from their season-long average on Sunday night, it was also on very few pass attempts. And the number was still below the league average. The target share they had against the Bears was still below the league's average. And I mentioned the pass attempts thing here because Gurley's kind of been on a snap count this year, or a usage count, at least compared to last year. So his almost 19% target share this past week, that was great. But it was also just 3 targets. If he saw a 19% target share on like 50 possible targets, then I'd be more inclined to say that things are really trending up for Todd Gurley, since that would be more overall volume, and that's where they've seemed to be worried about Gurley. Instead, I'm less optimistic. Now, Gurley had seen the type of running back rush share that he had in Week 11 earlier this year, but he hadn't had a combination of running back share and target share like he had against the Bears. So that's good news. But it's hard for me to sit on this show and say that he's back because that's too strong of a take. I think it's good news, and I think that he's trending up. Maybe that's not a bold take, but I'm not going to mention bold takes just for the sake of mentioning them. This next question is from @JakeAndersonFF. Who is your favorite deep running back stash for the rest of the season? Thanks. So two things need to happen in order for running backs to come out of nowhere and be useful from here on out. They either need the player in front of them to get hurt, or they need to overtake that player who's in front of them. Remember, we're talking about deep stashes here. So chances are you're just looking at handcuffs. And I can't predict injuries to know the exact handcuffs that will be useful. But I do think one interesting player could be Benny Snell. Jalen Samuels has been getting a lot of receiving volume when he's been the featured back, but so far he hasn't played all that well. James Conner's been banged up all year. The Steelers have been a fairly run-heavy team playing good defense, and they get the Cardinals, the Bills, and the Jets in the fantasy football playoffs. So maybe Benny Snell's going to be usable. But like I said, the most useful output that you're likely going to get from a running back is via an injury. That's how the position works in fantasy. This next question is from someone whose handle I can't really pronounce, but it says, please describe the schedule-adjusted part of points versus opponents. I get the straight-up numbers, but don't quite grasp that qualifier. Sorry, I was an English major. So let's just use an example. Matt Ryan's averaging 19.1 fantasy points per game. Aaron Rodgers is averaging 18.8. But clearly, Matt Ryan and Aaron Rodgers haven't faced the same opponents. So in order to see which player is actually playing better in fantasy given the opponents that they faced, you could look at the average points allowed by those opponents and see which player is exceeding that number more. So even though Matt Ryan is averaging more points, Aaron Rodgers may be playing better fantasy-wise given his schedule. And you can do that in reverse or for specific matchups as well. Look at how well teams have performed against certain positions in fantasy football, and then see how those positions perform the rest of the season and just compare and contrast. So when I say that a team is allowing X amount of points above or below expectation to certain positions in fantasy, it's based on how that team's opponents scored throughout the entirety of the season. Sometimes teams are going to face tough opponents. So later in the season, when that information is a little bit more reliable, it lets us see if that's been the case or not. That's really what the schedule-adjusted numbers thing is all about. This next question is from @Hunter_MC11. Should I have enough confidence in Aaron Rodgers to start him every week moving forward? 10-team, 1-quarterback league. Thanks, JJ. Love the pod. Hey, thanks. I mean, look, we've seen Aaron Rodgers not be reliable this year in fantasy football on multiple occasions. So I don't think that he's a weekly must start. There are only a few quarterbacks in the league right now who are, and I don't think he's part of it. He also gets San Francisco this week and then Chicago during the fantasy playoffs. Rodgers was QB 24 against Chicago earlier in the year, QB 24 against Denver, QB 22 against Dallas, and he's been QB 21 and QB 22 over his last two games. Let's not pretend that he's been lights out as a fantasy asset. Does he have a ceiling almost as high as anyone? Yes. But there are weeks where there may be a better option for you, especially in a 10-team league. This next question is from @FenBogpa. Will Leonard Fournette ever score again? Now look, I know that this is more of a joke than anything else, but the last couple of games for Jacksonville have been kind of a bummer because they've had such negative game scripts. In week 9, they ran 71 offensive plays while trailing. In week 11, it was 51. It's kind of hard for a running back to find the end zone when his team is throwing at a higher rate because of game script. So I will just say, I just want to throw it out there. It's been an unfortunate couple of weeks for Leonard Fournette. This next question is from @KC of ATX. Sorry for repeating the same question, but it's my biggest focus in my main league. Who would you be targeting here at the end of the season in a full rebuild in a dynasty league? Had to blow up my uncompetitive roster. Thanks, love the show. The top thing to do in situations like this is to look at underperforming rookies who you liked coming out, and then look at players who are injured that are also on competitive teams. Some of those underperforming rookies could be someone like Andy Isabella, maybe JJ Arcega-Whiteside, maybe even AJ Brown. It's really going to be team dependent though. Like for instance, a team that's not doing very well, they're not just going to give up one of these rookies at a cheaper price because they're not going to win this year anyway. And for the record, this is how I approach almost anything in fantasy football trades. It's not just about getting specific players. When you do that, you tend to overpay. It's about finding teams that need what you have and vice versa. That's why the overarching idea here is to get underperforming rookies and players who are hurt. Focus less on the specific player and more on that idea. This next question is from @DAELNOIC. I can't pronounce that. It says, please talk about how you use betting resources such as NumberFire to make fantasy football lineup decisions. Thanks. Yeah, so I mentioned OddsFire basically every week on this show, which you guys can go check out at oddsfire.com. And I mentioned how I use OddsFire for my own research. And that's true, I use it. I want to see where lines are moving and where money's being placed because it can tell me if games are looking like they're going to be lower scoring or higher scoring. And I want players who are in higher scoring games. So if the line is moving up and we all of a sudden have a shootout on our hands, I want players that are going to be part of that shootout. So in the case of tiebreakers and season long, I'll pick the player in the higher scoring contest. But for daily fantasy, it's obviously important for things like game stacking. OddsFire can help you figure all of that out. This next question says, love the show, thanks. Looking to have two defenses going into the playoffs. I have the Steelers and Patriots right now. Incredibly, the Ravens are available in my league. Of these three, what would be the best combo? I mean, they're all pretty elite options. You could argue they're the best three defenses for fantasy purposes that you can find for the fantasy playoffs. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'd consider rostering all three of them if it meant that a league mate couldn't have the Ravens defense. It does sound like you're in a relatively shallow league though, but that's probably the move. Now, if you can't do that, I'd prefer Baltimore over Pittsburgh, only because I trust that they'll be able to see more positive game scripts defensively. And they're playing as the best unit in football right now. But it really shouldn't shock anyone if any of those three defenses are able to dominate down the stretch. This next question is from @ShiftWorkLife. Hi JJ, love the show. Thanks. I'm out of the playoffs in my keeper league. Sad, but this week I'm dealing with injuries and heavy buys. My opponent is fighting for a first round bye. Is it ethical for me to not play a quarterback this week so that I don't have to drop a keepable asset? Thanks. Look, the way that I feel about any of these types of questions is that if there aren't rules around it, then it's fine. If no one has ever stated that you have to fill your roster, that you have to fill a starting lineup, then you don't have to do it. That's as long as you're not doing this to benefit your league mate's team. If you're partially making this move to help that person's team, then that's not okay. But the bottom line is you should do everything within the rules of your league, and you should do everything to benefit your own team and no one else's. It's not okay if you're doing this to benefit someone else's team. But I think it's as simple as that. This next question is from @dstens_8. Is Philip Lindsay a sneaky league winner this year with his playoff schedule? So this sort of plays into what I talked about on my matchup show this week with Royce Freeman. Since Joe Flacco's been out and not the starter, Denver running backs aren't being fed nearly as much as receivers. Philip Lindsay had a 5% target share this past week, and he saw 0 targets in week 9. The schedule is good in weeks 15 and 16, but they could also see a negative game script in that week 15 game against Kansas City. If that's the case and there hasn't been a quarterback change, there's definitely some fear that Lindsay won't see enough receiving volume to be a league winner. Now, I like his spot and I think that he should be started and all that. I'm just mostly referencing league winner here. I think his usage needs to improve before we can say that. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, do me a favor and leave a rating and review of the show. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your weekend and best of luck in Week 12.